This moves us to number 12, which is consider adopting 4 resolutions related to the 2022 Mesa County budget. Resolution 1, to adopt a budget. Resolution 2, to authorize appropriations. Resolution 3 would be to adopt a mill levy. Resolution 4, adopt authorized staffing levels. And presenting will be Pete Bear, our county administrator, and Spencer Rockwell, our budget manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. It's with great privilege and opportunity we present the fiscal year 2022 budget for the board. I want to highlight first and foremost that this process this year, I can say the commissioners were more engaged than I've seen in quite a while. They were very engaged and went through everything. And in addition, our electeds and appointeds were very much engaged. And a lot of that's credit to Spencer and some of the processes he's brought and continues to work on. So I wanted to point that out. As always, I want to thank the budget review team, which is made up of many of our fiscal and other folks from our larger departments that help us craft this and make sure that we look at their needs, but also look at the overall county budget. And I would just like to also mention that this is our first shot at a performance-based budget, and we'll continue to work that process out as we continue through. So with that, let's go to slide 2. Some of our highlights, which is, it's really an exciting opportunity. We did receive the American Rescue Plan dollars. Those dollars we are looking at as one-time dollars. In other words, we don't want to build big programs around them and not have those in the future. That being said, it allows us to move forward, which I know the board is well aware and the community is well aware, on our Clifton campus, which is going to include Early Childhood Education Center, a training hub, and a community hall, and also partnering with the library there. So great news for that area. As mentioned previously, we're working with some of the smaller districts, Mesa Water and Sand, Palisade, Colburn, and DeBeck, on needs that they have. And then we're also working hard on our supporting various mental health aspects throughout the community with these dollars and some of the budget dollars that we're looking at. We continue to invest in our county employees. This budget does include employee compensation. It was done per the processes at HR for equal pay for equal work, which was a big driver in looking at how we do that. And I know HR did a tremendous amount of work to get us there. It also good news in the sense of that health insurance premiums for employees actually went slightly down. Our usage last year was slightly less than anticipated, so we were able to take that money and show that the rates will go down slightly. This budget definitely promotes fiscal stability. We'll look a little closer farther in the presentation as to what that means, in particular for our fund balance in the general fund. As mentioned before, we're maximizing the beneficial use of federal funds. And we're really providing these back out to the community and one-time large capital projects that will really enhance what we have in our community. And then it does, we will see shortly here where there's a request for 27.5 FTEs to building capacity to meet the residents' needs for our services. So our building community together, as mentioned, we have a Clifton Community Campus, which is getting a lot of energy and a lot previously discussed already just in our bus routes and our bus systems, making sure we have ways to get folks there. This is quite a jewel, in particular in an area that's been neglected somewhat, and we'll be able to get there and do this. This is moving forward very rapidly. We'll have an architect hired here very shortly for final design on all these components, and I know the library is moving very quickly. So we anticipate breaking ground next year. That's roughly about $23 million that we're showing in this budget to initiate and work our piece. The DeBeck Community Hall, very excited about that. Just last week, we acquired the properties to be able to get and build that. Again, these were community halls that were promised to folks back in the 80s that we're just getting to finalizing and building those. And very exciting and very much will help in these areas. And not only that, will help the county continue to message into these areas and work with them very closely on these. Also, as mentioned, part of the dollars will be expanding access to critical services. We've talked already about partnering on municipal water and sewer with some of our smaller components. And I'm really excited about this next one, broadband. We're looking very hard. The voters did put trust in us to look at how we can help provide broadband to this area. So I know we're working very hard behind the scenes with a number of providers and sources of funding to get that done. So that is very much on our agenda for this coming year. Mental health support and healthcare support are big in our budget also, and as should be, in particular in times of the pandemic. Then also a very exciting project listed here in our budget is completion of the master plan, our strategic plan, and our county website. And these are all outreach or engaging components for our community, so we can continue to engage with them and also give transparency and show them what we're doing. So exciting to look at that. So as mentioned previously, it does include about $1.6 million for employee compensation. That's a lot of that was driven by the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. And when we evaluated that, and I got to give credit to HR, they did a tremendous job looking at every position in the county. Number of our lower positions are getting increases and moving up based on equal pay for equal work, and other positions are being adjusted based on where they fell in the range. And this is a very good, solid foundation for us to continue on and looking at compensation and working through those issues. So, as mentioned also, it does include employee savings on health insurance premiums. It ranges anywhere from a single folk of $72 a year to $171 if you're a family. That's probably the first time I've been able to say premiums are going down in quite a while. So that's a credit to our folks that manage that and just our employees and how they take care of themselves. This is doubling, adding additional 1% to the 457. That would make it a total of 2% in the retirement plan. And that is important in particular to some of our folks that are closer and trying to really establish those funds for retirement purposes. So probably more importantly, the fact we're able to do many things with this budget, which is great, but we're also promoting fiscal stability within the county. We continue to have our general fund reserves get to a much better shape than they were. Just a couple of years ago, we were in the 14+%, and now we're at 34% of our expenditures, general fund reserve. It's a very healthy thing to do as times are better a little bit, and putting that aside, and in addition, we continue to work hard on the process of making sure our services are out there at the same time. So the following is a list of the recommended FTEs, full-time equivalents, and many of these are either grant funded or funded by federal funds, such as our Human Services Group. We're recommending 8 folks there. The sheriff, additional 4.5. Solid waste, again, is an enterprise fund, so that comes out of the fees they collect. We're recommending 4. IT, I'm gonna switch a little bit and talk about IT and facilities and human resources. These are our internal service funds that support many things we do and also support some of the stuff we do outside. And all 3 of those were hit very severely back in the last depression, 09, 10, and 11. And we're just barely getting those back, and they really need that capacity, and they're going to be asked to do a tremendous amount more work as we continue to bring on processes and serve our community. The coroner had unfortunately, we've seen an increase in the request for coroner for services there. So we're looking at adding 2 FTEs there, and that also goes along with our new capital project we did for the coroner to bring that up to a much better standard. The district attorney's office, again, some grant funding that provides additional positions. Our county attorney office, also there's one position recommended in there for the county attorney's office. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our budget manager to talk a little bit more about the figures and funds things. So Spencer.
Thank you, Pete. Good morning, commissioners. So this slide gives you an overview of the top line figures in the 2022 budget, starting at the top with the general fund. And here you have a comparison between the budget that we're presenting to you today and the 2021 adopted budget, as well as the change in both dollar and percentage terms between those 2 adopted budgets. So looking at the general fund first, you can see that there's about a $4.9 million increase in general fund revenues. That's a 7% change. And I'll talk in a little bit in more detail about where that revenue is coming from and how we're using that in the budget. A slightly slower increase in expenditures at $73.4 million total expenditures in the 2022 budget, for about a $4.7 million increase, or 6.8%. Those are both a bit higher than we've seen in the last couple of years. That's certainly on the heels of strong revenue growth. That also has a lot to do with some of the really exciting things that Pete just talked about, including investments in our employees, some of the projects that we're doing in the community, as well as addressing some really important staffing needs that the county has had. On a total funds basis, you can see the gross revenues and expenditures for the county and the change from 2021 to 2022. I'm going to talk in just a moment about the net change and why there's a difference between those two, and why I think it's useful to use the net budget as a reference point for understanding the changes that Mesa County has seen going into 2022. But we always, of course, include those gross figures, and so we'll start there. Our final budget in 2022 that we present to you today includes about $241 million in revenue and just under $246 million in expenditures. And both of those numbers are increasing substantially. You can see an increase of over 1/4 in both revenues and expenditures. And like I said, we'll dissect that quite a bit here in the coming slides. The other top line figure that I want to point your attention to is the change in the mill levy. Now, keep in mind, Mesa County's base mill levy is 12.162. That's the most that the county is allowed to levy. But Tabor imposes more severe restrictions on us in most years pursuant to a property tax growth limit. And that's what's operating here to reduce our base mill levy down to the figures that you see for 2021 and 2022. That's the result of temporary tax credits or temporary mill levy reductions that allow the county to stay within that legal limit for property taxes that's imposed by Tabor. The growth rate has increased this year. That's both because we've seen more new construction in the last year that's adding value to our property tax rolls, and it's also because inflation has been high by recent historical standards. And so our mill levy is allowed to increase. Again, the base mill levy stays the same, but we see a smaller reduction vis-a-vis those temporary tax credits. So I mentioned that the net budget is probably a more useful and illuminating reference point for understanding the really big changes in both revenues and expenditures from 2021 to 2022. And those top couple of lines tell you what those net budget figures are. But I just want to start by clarifying that the gross budget includes all of our county funds, more than 20 different funds that have very specific restrictions and requirements, with the notable exception, of course, of the general fund, which is our most flexible source of discretionary funds. When we make transfers between funds, which we do all the time to facilitate everyday operations, those transfers show up as an expenditure from the fund that the money is leaving and revenue for the fund that the money is entering. But it doesn't really represent new net revenue to the county. For instance, if we were to collect, when we collect sales tax, of course the county recognizes that as revenue, in particular into our general fund and our capital fund. If we transferred a portion of that sales tax revenue to any other fund outside of one of those two that I just mentioned, it would again count as revenue to the new fund that's receiving those funds. And I go through this kind of detailed, arcane explanation to point out that in strict accounting terms, there's a lot of money that gets sort of counted or budgeted twice. And so it can inflate the overall gross figures and make them seem larger than the amount of money that the county is really bringing in or that we're spending. The net budget takes those transfers out of the equation. It counts every piece of revenue once, and it counts every expenditure once. It also takes out of the equation the money that is charged or transferred between funds to take care of the internal services that our departments like IT and facilities and human resources and risk and so on and so forth provide. The county is a really large business, and so many of our departments in some ways operate as sub-businesses, charging one another for their services so that we make sure that we're accurately capturing and reflecting the costs of doing business. But again, on a gross basis, that can really make our figures seem quite inflated. So, to the numbers, you can see in that second to left column for final budget in 2022 that the total funds figure is quite a bit smaller for both revenues and expenditures. $202.5 million in revenues on a net revenue basis, and about $207 million in net expenditures, for changes around 40 rather than 50 plus million dollars. These are still really large changes, but you can see that there's quite a difference between the net and the gross figures. So drilling down just a little bit deeper to figure out, well, why are the numbers so big this year? Why are we expecting to see 25% growth in revenues? There are really three key sources, and they relate both to revenues and expenditures, but I've highlighted them in terms of revenues here. The first major source of funds that Pete has already talked a lot about is the American Rescue Plan. The American Rescue Plan counts for $18.1 million in new revenue. And as Pete mentioned, these are one-time funds. Now, the county expects to receive a total of $30 million in American Rescue Plan funds, so this accounts for a little bit more than half of that. In future budgets or in budget adjustments throughout 2022, we'll start to account for the remainder of those American Rescue Plan dollars. But you can see that nearly half of our new revenue and expenditures in 2022 is derivative of one source, and that's this one-time infusion of federal relief dollars. That's going to make a tremendous impact on the county, but when we come around to budget time in 2023, it's also a reason why you're likely to see revenue and expenditure growth at much lower levels than this kind of atypical 2022. The other two sources, which of course are typical sources of county revenue, two of our biggest sources of revenue, are also seeing really big changes, and I want to talk a little bit about why and how that's reflected in our budget. So the 2021 adopted budget for sales and use taxes was just over $47 million. In 2022, we're budgeting for about 58.3, which is $11 million more, almost a quarter higher than 2021. What's going on here? Well, our sales tax projection, every budget includes a projection. We budget to a number because we collect sales tax on a monthly basis, so we don't know what we're going to get in the subsequent year. Our sales taxes in 2021 have greatly exceeded the number that you see as 47.3 for the budget. In fact, our method for projecting or budgeting sales tax in 2022 is to take what we expect to get, what we have received in the last 11 months of 2021, and what we expect to get in the final month of 2021, and just budget that for 2022. This is actually a pretty conservative approach, but it doesn't really look like it on paper. And so, in other words, the $58.3 million in sales and use taxes that you see in the 2022 budget, that's what we're going to have collected in 2021. We were very, very conservative in estimating at the beginning of this year what we were going to receive. And that's because so much was still up in the air. But sales taxes and use taxes have vastly exceeded even the most optimistic expectations at the beginning of the year. We expect that by the end of the year, we will have collected $58.3 million. We're budgeting for the exact same amount across all funds in 2022. So on a budget-to-budget basis, this is a large increase. On an actuals to budget basis, this is a 0% increase. Property taxes is the final source, and of course this is a major source of county revenue and one that our public is rightly very interested in. This, like sales tax, was underestimated in the 2021 budget. We are going to have collected a little over $1 million more than what we budgeted for in 2021. In 2022, what we budget for is essentially that property tax growth limit that I just described in relationship to our mill levy. We believe, based on the increase in our assessed value, based on the high rate of collection from eligible taxpayers, that we will collect the taxes, the maximum amount of property taxes that we are allowed to collect based on that mill levy of 11.892 in 2022. Again, a 13.3% increase over budget, but actually shy of a 10% increase over what we've actually collected in 2021. So to tie this all together and look back at the big picture, if you take all of those, just those three sources of revenue combined, that accounts for $32.3 million, about 80% of the new revenue that we're budgeting for in 2022 versus 2021. So there are certainly some big numbers. I can understand why folks might have some sticker shock in looking at the change from 2021 to 2022. But when you drill down and you look at the net budget, and then you look at the sources of revenue within that net budget, I think it's a little bit easier to understand how we get from 1 year, very conservatively estimated with fewer significant federal relief dollars incoming, to a year where we're truing up those estimates, basing them on the actual recent history that we've experienced, while not predicting a continuation of large growth and taking into account this one-time infusion of dollars from the federal government. Looking at the general fund in particular, I mentioned that the general fund is one where we spend a lot of our time and attention because it is the most flexible source of operating dollars for the county. This gives you an idea of how our beginning and ending balances are reflected in the budget and how that's changed from the proposed to the final budget, which is what I want to turn to now. The biggest changes from proposed to final occur in the beginning balance and occur in the revenues and expenditures that we budget for. Why the change in the beginning balance? When we come to you in October with the proposed budget, we bring to you a beginning balance for 2022 that's based strictly on what we've budgeted in 2021. Budgeted revenues minus budgeted expenditures plus an audited beginning balance for 2021. Now we come to you knowing 11 out of 12 months worth of data. Just about everything that is going to happen this year, the dollars spent, the dollars received, has transpired. And therefore, we're in a much better position to make a projection about what we're actually going to spend and what we're actually going to receive in revenues. And the good news is that we're going to spend less than we've budgeted, and we're going to receive more revenue than we estimated. And I just talked about the revenue side of that. The expenditure side of that is really a testament to our departments being good fiscal stewards, to our board, to our county administrator, to our budget review team, all of the folks who have their hands in being fiscal stewards in the county, doing an excellent job of managing their operations, not only staying within budget, but actually coming in under budget, at about 95 to 96% of what we appropriated. So as a result of that higher than expected revenue and lower than budgeted expenditure, we're actually looking at adding roughly $5 million to the general fund balance in for the 2022 beginning balance. So that's the first really big change that's transpired in how we budget since October to now. In terms of revenues and expenditures, you can see about a $2 million increase, just shy of that figure in both revenues and expenditures. Our sales tax forecast did increase a little bit. That's because 2021 numbers have continued to come in much stronger than budgeted or expected. On the expenditure side, we're going to go into more detail in the next two slides about some of the things that have changed between proposed and final. And you can see that there was a small change in what we expect our operating surplus to be in the general fund. And because of that big change, primarily in beginning balance, we now budget or expect to end 2022 with just shy of $31 million in our general fund balance. That's our total balance. Pete spoke to you earlier about general fund balance and the importance of that for fiscal stability. I'll just make one note. We typically focus, and the slide that Pete showed was really honed in on the unassigned general fund balance. That is the fund balance that is not restricted for any purpose. Our general fund balance includes a handful of things, roughly $4 to $5 million, that cannot be used for any purpose. This is the total balance, the $30.1 million in ending for 2022. So if you subtract about 4 to 5 from that, we end the year with an unassigned balance of about $26 million. And that's what can be used when unexpected expenditures arise, when an emergency occurs, or when we have an unexpected revenue shortfall. So let's dive just a little bit deeper into the changes from the proposed to the final budget. We covered a lot of what was in the budget in our October presentation. Many of those things have remained the same, but some of them, and particularly some of the amounts, have changed as we've improved our forecasting with new data and as we've finalized several pieces that were still outstanding at that time. So I've categorized these expenditures into kind of broader categories that capture the many different lines and specific pieces of the budget that have changed. That first one, finalizing compensation, really covers everything from refining our numbers based on the new compensation plan that Human Resources is implementing, refining our estimates of the increase in county match on the 457 retirement plan, as well as capturing some changes in staffing that are happening as we close out the year in 2021. Departments don't always agree with the recommendations made by the budget review team or with what's included or not included in the proposed budget that we present to you in October. And so they have the opportunity in November to come and make an appeal, and the commissioners hear that and consider that in light of all the information about the budget. So a number of appeals were resolved in favor of some of those department requests. That entailed adding some new staff as well as adding amounts to the budget. As you can see there, about $700,000 in additional general fund expenses and about $1.2 million across all funds accounted for by resolving those budget appeals. Errors and omissions. I'm human, and so is our budget review team, and so it always happens that we go through a really rigorous quality review process, certainly before the proposed budget, but especially between October and December, and that gives us the opportunity to catch everything from fat finger errors to miscommunications, et cetera, et cetera. That's what you see reflected in that line. It's a very small amount. That's where we want to keep it in the general fund. And in fact, we were able to reduce expenditures across all funds by about $200,000 by catching those errors. And that last category there that I've broken down a little bit further is just generally considered adjustments based on new data. A lot of things, as it happens, change in our operating picture and how we understand our revenue forecast and how we plan to use different funds between October and December. And that's what you see reflected there. And the two biggest changes that I'll call out are the American Rescue Plan and the Capital Improvement Plan. The Capital Improvement Plan is one of the least finished pieces of the proposed budget in October. And so that's something that we always anticipate will continue to change, and that's because capital projects are still ongoing through the end of the year. They never really stop. They don't obey neat timelines all the time. And so our Capital Improvement Plan is really very fluid up until the time that we come to you in December with a final budget. And closely related to that is our American Rescue Plan dollars. And the reason for the big change here, or the biggest reason, I should say, for the change, is because the proposed budget did not incorporate the funds that we plan to distribute to municipalities vis-a-vis intergovernmental agreements. At that time, it was unclear what the timing of those intergovernmental agreements might look like. Now that we know the timing much better, and those transfers are expected to take place in 2022, we can account for those here. The last piece that I'll highlight very quickly is insurance. We never know insurance figures until really the last couple of weeks of our budget cycle. And so those are added late. We try and budget quite conservatively. This year we were expecting a large increase in premiums, about 25%. The actual increase in premiums was slightly lower than that, but we're fortunate to have budgeted the way that we did because it means that we don't have last minute emergencies in the week leading up to this presentation. On the revenue side of things, we've talked a little bit about sales and use taxes and what's behind those forecasts. Property taxes, we get the final certification of assessed values from the county assessor every December 1st. And so that allows us to put much more precise estimates into place for property taxes, whereas in October, we rely on a preliminary certification of assessed values, and there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding how our property tax forecast is going to play out. Some big changes on the intergovernmental side. A lot of that has to do with finalizing our CIP and getting a slightly clearer picture of the grants and contracts that we can expect to receive revenue from. Everything from RTPO, which of course receives a lot of federal money to support their rolling stock purchases, to our engineering department, which receives various grants for bridge and road improvements. Transfers and charges, we talked about that in relationship to kind of the gross budget. Again, that's how we account for the internal business that we do to maintain operational support for our many departments. And because of the decrease in insurance charges and because of a variety of things related to how we account for transfers from one fund to the next, particularly transfers of ARP dollars into the capital improvement plan, you see that that number actually came down considerably, just shy of $4 million across all funds. Speaking of capital improvement plan, this graph gives you a look at the 2022 revenues and expenditures. Of course, as the title of the slide indicates, our improvement plan looks 6 years out. But we really focus in particular on the first 2 years. 2022 and 2023 are what we've spent the most time trying to refine over the last couple of months. We're spending more out of the capital fund than we typically do, and that's driven primarily by that large light blue amount at the top there, facilities. The bulk of that, of course, is for the Clifton Community Campus that we're really excited about. That also includes funds to begin Justice Center remodels. That includes funds for our HVAC replacement program and our asset preservation program, which maintains our county buildings. On the revenue side, you can see the $14.3 million in that middle bar from the American Rescue Plan. That's contributing really to a number of things in the capital improvement plan on the expenditure side, but in particular that Clifton Community Campus. On just switching back to expenditures real quickly, what you see below the facilities number is much more typical of our 6-year capital improvement plans. Public Works, of course, are transportation system improvements. Fleet and RTPO are two kind of annual ongoing items, our department vehicle replacement and bus replacements for our TPO. And then IT, that other bar at the very bottom, includes everything from purchasing body cams for our sheriff's deputies working in our detention facility, to our debt service or COP payments, to some grants that the county makes to support economic development. On the revenue side, again, American Rescue Plan is probably the headline here. It's the most unique piece, but sales tax is by far the largest revenue source that supports our county capital projects. Grants and contracts constitutes about $9 million. And again, I talked about federal grants that we receive for transportation improvements, for Grand Valley Transit. That also includes grant money that we expect to receive to support the construction of the Clifton Community Campus, about $4 million in non-county funds outside of the ARP dollars that we plan to bring in. So, in terms of our fund balance in capital, unlike the general fund, This is not a fund where we strive to maintain a really high balance. This is a fund where we strive to spend the money that we get within reasonable bounds so that we can continue to improve county infrastructure, county facilities, and provide high quality of life and safety to the residents of Mesa County. We have a lot of fund balance because we've received more sales taxes than expected, because the American Rescue Plan is helping to offset a number of our costs in capital. And so we plan to use a considerable portion, about $5 million of the fund balance that will be sitting in capital at the end of this year. That's still going to leave us with a considerable balance at the end of 2022 on the basis of our budget, about $8 million. But if you look at the entirety of our 6-year capital improvement plan, what you see is that, especially over the next 3 years, we're really ambitious in terms of budgeting projects that are going to support all of the things that we just talked about on this slide and spend that fund balance down considerably to about $1 or $2 million range. The second to last slide that I wanted to show you is just to give more detail about one of the resolutions that's before you today, and this is related to setting the mill levy. This is, of course, a really important duty of boards of county commissioners, and the resolution provides this level of detail, but I wanted to make sure and put it in front of you as well as our audience. We calculate our mill levy by starting with our base mill levy. As I said earlier, that's the maximum that the county is allowed to levy, unless we were to go to voters and ask to override that and increase the mill levy. The way that gets distributed in Mesa County is between 5 funds. The general fund receives the lion's share of property taxes, which is to say that property taxes is really our key general operating source. Dollars in don't come with any restrictions. They can be used to conduct really any manner of county business. From there, we also provide a portion of the mill levy and therefore the property tax revenue to our Department of Human Services. They receive the second largest chunk. To our Road and Bridge Department, half of that money stays in the county. Half of that money is distributed to our municipalities for their own transportation projects. A portion of the mill levy goes to our Developmental Disabilities Fund. In our case here in this community, that goes to Strive for the work that they do with our IDD community. And then the smallest chunk by far goes to our TV translator. And you can see how both the mill levy and in turn the property tax revenue is broken out among those funds. In 2022, we are estimating a temporary tax credit that reduces our base mill levy by 0.270. Put a more, I think, clear or intuitive way, that means that we're going to receive just over $600,000 less in property tax revenue than if we were able to levy the full 12.162 mills. In total, you can see about $27.4 million in new property taxes. And the thing that isn't on this slide, but is important to note, we've talked about it before, the biggest driver of change in our property tax revenue this year is our assessed value. It sits at about $2.3 billion this year. That's a new record high. That's 6% higher than our final certified assessed value last year. That's pretty significant growth, and we've seen a lot of new construction. And because of the way the Tabor property tax growth limit is calculated, the high inflation that we've seen in the last year also contributes to our ability to collect more revenue within the limit. So the final slide is just to make a note of several things that we will continue to monitor, several things that we've looked very closely at in thinking about our budget estimates and what risks or opportunities we might face in 2022. Each one of these could certainly be a slide on its own, but I'm just going to tick through them quickly because I think most of them we've talked about. The first is obviously job creation and employment growth. We've seen really strong numbers for both of those kind of headline statistics in the last half of 2021. And the expectation among economists generally is that we'll continue to see those in 2022. There's still a lot of slack in the labor market. So there's an opportunity to get more folks back in the workforce here in Mesa County and elsewhere. and that's really an opportunity to see more economic activity, and that underlies our confidence in sales taxes at least remaining where they are for 2022. Inflation expectations is the second really key factor here. And I say inflation expectations as opposed to inflation. Inflation is already high by recent historical standards. But what economists will often talk about is not the inflation figure itself, but what do people think will happen with inflation? Because what I think will happen with inflation determines what I will do with my money today as a consumer, as a taxpayer. If people begin to believe that inflation is going to be elevated for a protracted period of time, that's when we really get into really troubled waters economically. And that's when we start to see impacts to what people are willing to go out and spend in the community, when we see impacts on whether people decide to take that extra vacation and go to the Peach Fest in Mesa County or whatever. So inflation expectations is something that nationally folks are going to be watching, and certainly it's going to have an impact on us here in Mesa County if, by and large, consumers expect inflation to be very high for a long period of time. Supply chain disruptions, I hardly think I need to go into much detail here, because I think every time I talk to the commissioners, we talk about this issue. I think it comes up in a lot of ways. It came up earlier when our fleet supervisor, Eric, was up here talking about how long it's taking to get vehicles. That obviously impacts how long it takes for us to complete really, really important projects, and it impacts the cost of getting those projects done. So this is a big impact all across the county. We're especially concerned about where this might affect our capital improvement plan. Federal fiscal and monetary policy have obviously been really significant factors in county revenues over the last 2 years. We've received relief dollars in 2020 and 2021. We'll receive the second payment of ARP dollars in 2022. We're not expecting another huge stimulus package, but there was a major infrastructure bill just signed, $550 billion in new federal spending coming down the line over the next several years. And it's likely that Mesa County will benefit from some of those infrastructure dollars. There's obviously a large social spending bill making its way through Congress right now. We make no predictions about what Congress is going to do, about what the top line figure or final number on any of those bills is going to be. But we do know that the federal government is spending money right now, and some of that money is finding its way either to Mesa County government or to Mesa County residents and businesses, and that's impacting our local economy in a positive way. And of course, monetary policy has contributed to that as well, but in some ways maybe presents more of an uncertainty or more of a risk factor as we start to look out over the next 3 to 5 years. We do expect that monetary policy will be less loose as we go forward, at least to the extent that there's not much more loosening you can do at the federal level. And then last but not least, migration, in particular population growth here in the county, has obviously been a big factor. That's more consumers, that's more taxpayers, but it's also more folks that we're serving. And depending on where they live and what their expectations are of county services, that means that we're constantly adapting and changing and making sure that we're meeting the changing needs of a growing community. Pete mentioned earlier the members of our budget review team, but I'll just reiterate the special thanks and gratitude that I owe to them as a first-time budget manager, my first time here in Mesa County at least, and the work that they do over the course of about a month and a half is really tremendous. These are the foremost experts on county money, how our budget works, how our funds work, how to account for it, and so I personally certainly owe them a debt of gratitude for the work, for the input that they've provided and the support that they've provided, and the ability that I have to call any one of them up on the phone and get an explanation of how something works in the county. I'll turn it back over to Pete.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. So with that presentation, before you are 4 resolutions. One of them is to adopt the budget. One is to authorize appropriations. One is to adopt the mill levy as shown. And then one is to authorize staffing levels. So That's the presentation we have. I will say the budget will be available later today for anybody that wants to look at it. And the website is listed there. It's just on the Mesa County website under Finance Budget 2022. So that will all be there in great detail. And again, I just want to throw my heartfelt thanks both to Spencer as a budget manager coming in new this year and mid-year. So threw him to the wolves sort of. And then to our budget review team and the folks that in particular in a year, as mentioned, that with numerous opportunities, but also many numerous challenges. So we'll continue to work. I am pleased that we have a good team that can respond quickly when things change, and both on an opportunistic standpoint and from a standpoint when things change in the community that causes us to pull back and take a look at it. So that is the budget presentation for this year, and we are open to any questions from the board.
Just for clarification, Council, we can make these all under one motion, correct? All the resolutions, all 4 resolutions. Okay. Commissioner McGinnis, do you have any questions?
Just one point I want to make for the benefit of the public, and that is at the beginning we talked about the American Rescue dollars and mental health support of about $500,000. It's important for folks to realize the county spends a lot more money than that on mental health, whether it's our Department of Health, our Department of Human Services, Strive, contributions to things like Strive, and even the Sheriff's Department that deals with our prison inmate population. So we spend a large amount of resources. I just don't want the public to think that the money we have, we only put $500,000. It's a big budget item for us. It affects us every year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Rowland?
I would just add that I'm thankful to see such a strong fund balance that's nearly double what it was a few years ago. And that even though it appears the fund balance overall has dropped, most all of that is from the capital fund, which it should be spent and out on the streets. No pun intended. So I'm just thankful for a strong fund balance, and I have no other questions.
Okay, first of all, I just want to say, Spencer, well done. Pete, well done. To all the team, well done. Performance budgeting, you said it was going to be a challenge this year, and you've pulled it off pretty well, and we'll progress as we go through the years, but I'm really excited about it. I'm excited about metrics for the desired performances that we want out of our budget, and it's exciting times, and I'm looking forward to the future. We've started a lot of projects this year in Mesa County, from Clifton campus, town halls, sewer and water improvements, working on broadband enhancements. So I'm really excited to see what Team Mesa is doing this year, and looking forward to 2022. Really excited about our fund balance continuing to go up. We know this last year was a great year for revenue, but we know leaner years are coming. So I really appreciate the team putting together a fund balance that's going to only increase with the additional revenue we have coming in. And I did just want to make a final comment. I know it's easy to see the new budget up $50 million from last year, but I just want people to understand a lot of that has to do with the American Rescue Plan and that double booking, because it comes in and out of different funds. So there is a lot of extra dollars on top of that. So I appreciate you going through the net so people can understand exactly what we are actually bringing in locally. And now we are. Sales tax is up substantially, and I imagine there will be a substantial return in the future, given that we're still governed by that Tabor limit. So anyways, thank you. Wonderful presentation. Do we have any comments from the public on this item? We're spending $250 million. Does anybody have any comment on this item? Okay. I'll bring it back for a motion.
And my understanding, Mr. Chair, is we can include
all 4 resolutions.
All 4 resolutions. So
in
I
one
will
motion.
make the appropriate motion. That's the motion to include on all 4 of those. So moved.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. So moved. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.